Alright, so in this video, I'm going to talk to you specifically about the technique we prescribe to here at the Cavaliers, which is simply just called wrist break. A vast majority of the baselines in our activity prescribe to this technique, or at least a lot of baselines are actually moving towards it. If you watch any Cavalier baselines in the past, you might have noticed that our technique was a little bit steeper, it was a higher angle, and it was actually what we called a hybrid technique. It was kind of a cross between rotation and wrist break, but now we're kind of focusing on flattening the angle a little bit and moving towards pure wrist break. What's great about it and why we use it is there's not much to learn. If you're a percussionist, you know how to play this way already. Here's the first major point you need to think about, which will put the whole thing in perspective and make it a lot easier to comprehend. So really, you just need to ask yourself, how would I play if I was playing flat on a pad? Or rather, would this look bad or look silly if I was playing vertically? We're doing nothing different here, and that's the first mistake a lot of people make when they approach bass drum, is they treat it like it's a completely different instrument and they change the mechanics of how they move their hands. It is on a different plane. We're attacking horizontally as opposed to vertically. But really the only thing that happened is you rotated your forearm around, and nothing else should change past that. Most players, when they get behind a bass drum, because we're coming at it from a different angle, the first thing they do is they feel, because the implement is much heavier and we're coming at it from a different angle, they adjust by using an excessive arm, which really doesn't help. Think about what that would look like if you were playing on any other vertical percussion instrument. If you were playing on a pad or a marching snare drum, that would look pretty ridiculous and your instructor would tell you to stop. We don't do this when we play flat, so therefore you should not go like this when you're playing on a bass drum. Second big visual tendency is a lot of people want to move downward. Now, a second tendency that happens when people step behind a bass drum is they want to also add a downward motion. Now, when you're standing parallel to someone playing a bass drum, right, it looks like when the mallet's coming towards you, it does look like it's going down. This is an optical illusion that's created by the angle of the mallet. So when we're playing, we have the mallet at a 45-degree angle, right? So when your wrist moves outward, naturally the mallet is going to move on that plane. If we have the mallet at a 45 and it moves along this plane, it's going to move towards you like this, right? So it looks like the mallet is moving down, but actually what happens is it's moving on that 45-degree angle. So it's not necessarily moving down. If you look where I have the pivot point right here, I'm lining up the mallet with the camera. Look, this hand is not moving down. It's just that the mallet is moving at a 45-degree angle, so it creates this illusion that the mallet's moving down, but actually the pivot point is staying in the same spot. So make no mistake, you don't need to add any downward motion to your technique. Again, if we thought about what that would be vertically, that would be like if you were playing on a pad and going like this. That is a completely inefficient way to play. And if we were to play like that on a bass drum, we would actually be kind of scraping the surface. As it hit the drum, it would be kind of scraping upward, and that's going to change the fidelity of your sound. As with most percussion instruments, pretty much all of them, you want the bead of the stick, implement, mallet, whatever, to go straight into the surface because that's going to produce the best sound. We're going to skew our sound if we're scraping the mallet along the head, right? So we do not want to add any sort of downward motion. So there's two nasty tendencies we want to be aware of right away that sprout from either A, relying on using too much arm, or visually misinterpreting how other bass lines play, right? Because of that optical illusion the 45-degree angle takes, right? People think they need to move downward. So again, very simple question to ask yourself when you're looking at yourself while playing is, would I do this if I was playing vertically? Or like I said, would this look bad? Alright, so that was what not to do and getting some misconceptions out of the way. Now let's talk about what you should do and how to set up the technique. Make sure your shoulders are down. Keep your arms relaxed right by your side. You don't need to puff them out or anything. And we're just going to bend straight from our elbows. Your forearm needs to be parallel to the ground, right? Not angled up or not angled down. So this is a little difficult to achieve unless you have a mirror in front of you. So when you are initially setting this up, or you're coming back to it after a while when we're revisiting for auditions, you really need to get in front of a mirror and check that angle. I always say it's like we're just reaching out for a handshake, but that also means your wrist. If we were to reach straight up for a handshake, we would have our arm parallel, but we would also have our wrist in line with our forearm. That is huge. Your wrist is meant to move this way, and we want it to move this way. Yes, your wrist does go up and down, but frankly not that far, because that's not its primary motion. Physically, the reason why your wrist is able to move up and down is to support this motion and so that your wrist won't break if it goes at any other odd angles. But make no mistake, your wrist is meant to go this way, so we want to drum this way. This is also how you create long-term wrist problems as well. If you were to be having your hand angled up and then still trying to move it this way, you're kind of grinding that joint in a way that it's not supposed to. You're pulling on the tendon in a weird way, and you're grinding that joint. So frankly, for your wrist health, it is better to make sure it is in line and it's moving, like I said, in the primary way that it's meant to be. So like I said before, the way we play and the way we hold this mallet is the way that you would hold a snare stick, a tenor stick, really any other percussion implement. We want a nice, open, even grip. We have a connected fulcrum. Our thumb is in line with our index finger, not too high, because again, if your thumb gets too high, then we shove all our fingers down. We're kind of holding it like it's a club or a baseball bat. We don't want that. Thumb in line with your index finger, nice even grip, and get those bottom two fingers wrapped all the way around. I'd say that's a big thing that people underutilize, and I'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. Once you bend from your elbows, you are going to have to open up your elbows a tiny bit, but we're talking a couple inches. We don't want to fan out super big, because watch, if I show you from this angle, if I were to fan my elbows out too much, then it actually kind of puts too much of an angle in your wrist, and your wrist is already starting kind of broken, right? We don't want that. Again, we want our forearm in line with our wrist, but again, if our elbows are too tucked into our sides, then, right, we don't make it all the way around the rim, and then opposite, we have to curl our wrists around. So you just want your elbows out, here's relaxed, and then here's like an inch, right? Just a little bit to support that angle, so that we have one straight line angle going from our elbow all the way up to the head of the mallet, nice and relaxed. A big thing that produces that angle is what your thumb is doing. Now, your thumb, if you notice, mine, it's curved. That's what it should look like. It should feel like you're kind of pressing on a button. If I lit up some pressure on this thumb, look, see what happens to my angle, right? It can drop a few inches by me not having enough pressure in it. But then again, if I press too much, right, it pushes it too forward into my hand, and now the mallet is sitting in my finger pads and not inside the palm of my hand. We want our mallet going across our hand comfortably, not too far this way, not too far that way. So your thumb is a huge part of that. And the other huge part that I think this is the bigger mistake that people make is not using their bottom two fingers. Yes, the thumb makes sure that you have the correct angle, but you know what also helps keep it in your palm? These two fingers being a little snuggy and holding it against your hand. You want the mallet against your hand. Like I said earlier, that's a huge part of this technique. If the mallet is in your hand, then the mallet will go wherever your hand goes. I know you've seen those beautiful pictures of bass lines where all five of them are looking mean, looking to the sky, and boom, you see the inside of their hand like this. You notice that mallet is inside the palm of their hand and it's making contact. That's because they have enough pressure in those bottom two fingers. The opposite, if they were too loose, would be this picture. And way too many people have this picture. It kind of, not only does their fulcrum get broken, but then the mallet isn't touching their hand. That's a big mistake people make. So if you have a weak bottom two fingers, you're not controlling the mallet enough, and then you actually kind of start making this shape with your hand instead of here, right? So when we prep outward, we want it to look like this and not so much this, right? That's terrible. So, the motion. Like I said, think about point one. What would I do if I was playing vertically? A lot of people, like I said, bad habit, the first thing they do is boom, the whole arm moves and then they get a little bit of wrist break. We want the wrist to be our primary motion, so you get a lot of wrist and maybe a little bit of arm. But here's the thing about arm. We're not intentionally using it. Here's the difference between me intentionally using my arm and having my arm be a byproduct of my wrist motion. So if I'm purposely using my arm, what happens is this is my primary motion, right? And if I add a little bit of wrist break, like a couple inches of wrist, then it looks like this, right? We don't want that. What we want is this. The wrist is the primary motion, and if you look, my arm isn't staying completely still. My arm is moving, but it's moving about this much. It's moving about an inch. That's because if I were to freeze my arm, that would look very robotic and uncomfortable. But if I allow my arm to be relaxed, my arm is just moving to support my wrist. My arm is a byproduct of my wrist motion. That's really important to think about with your arm. So make sure all your arm movement is natural. It just comes from you being relaxed. We don't want ridiculous, chicken wings or big elbows flying out. We want to keep the upper part of our arm, bicep, also relaxed, but make sure we're not winging it out. But your forearm can move. If I'm really moving that wrist, if it's flying back, if I do a forte note on the head and it flies back with a ton of rebound, yeah, when my wrist flies out, if my arm is relaxed, it's going to pull my arm along for the ride. So it's going to come out an inch or two. We don't want this, right? We don't want all the way out here. And we definitely don't want, like I said before, those fake motions where I purposely reach out or I purposely angle down, right? If my wrist flies out, it's going to pull my arm. And then when my wrist comes back in, my arm comes back in. So the difference is, like I said, when arm is the primary motion, you're doing this. You're getting about 6 to 12 inches of arm. Whereas what we truly want is the arm to be a byproduct following the wrist motion, and we just get a comfortable bounce. That's what I call it, a comfortable bounce. So your forearm is only going to move a couple inches, but your wrist is doing all the heavy lifting, and we get that beautiful angle like you see in all those Instagram-worthy photos. So I'm going to play some legato strokes for you. I'm going to play some basic, just 8 on a hand, and I'll show you what that difference looks like. So first, I'm going to make my arm the primary motion and show you what that looks like.
So as you can see, I'm really going for it with my arm here. The common misconception is this is more powerful. It's actually just really extremely tiring. It's really taxing to do, and it doesn't produce more sound. You could produce just as much, if not more volume, by applying a lot of velocity with purely your wrist. So this arm doesn't really help much. The other bad habit I mentioned before, right? Adding that artificial downward slice. Again, also super tiring. You really feel this in your triceps, and it is not fun. And then we have what we are striving for, making the wrist the primary motion. Look how much more relaxed I look, how much more comfortable it is. Yes, my arm is moving, but it's supporting my wrist motion, right? It's a byproduct of the wrist motion, that little bounce, that little bob, but my wrist is producing all of the sound, and it's a better sound that's just as loud, if not louder. Here we are back to using too much arm. I'm doing some accent tap now. This is extremely tiring, extremely taxing. It makes your hands really tight too. Here's me doing the same thing, slicing. You can see I'm scraping the head. You really feel this in the forearms. It's not comfortable. And then again, using my wrist to make these accents happen. I'm not using an excessive amount of force. It's nice and comfortable, and it looks good. So if someone takes one of those pretty pictures of you, you'll look good.
Moral of the story, play how you play any other percussion instrument. Don't approach bass drum like it's a different thing. Don't be a little barbarian or a savage and have your thumb up here and your fingers squeezed together, and don't beat it like you're holding a hammer or you're trying to club something. Play it like an instrument. Nice, open, even grip, how you hold really any other percussive implement. Play vertically on a pad. It translates. Yes, it feels a little bit different, but it shouldn't by that much. Especially those of you that are younger, don't zone out when your instructors are talking to the snares or the tenors and they're giving them advice about their hands and what to do. Listen, because a lot of that information could apply to you directly, and they could be tendencies that you have with your own hands. Or if they give them tips about what they should feel and how they should move their stick, pay attention. A lot of that will apply to you as well. You're just on a different plane, but the mechanics are the same. I promise you that.